Before we begin, if you're interested in the hidden forensic breakthroughs that exposed Cold War espionage operations and the devastating human consequences that followed, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We document these forgotten intelligence cases every week, bringing you the real stories behind some of history's most significant counterintelligence investigations. Now, let's talk about how microscopic traces on photocopied documents unraveled a 5-year espionage operation and destroyed an American family. On the morning of March 6, 1981, a forensic analyst named Gerald Mitchum sat at a workbench in the FBI's Technical Services Division laboratory in Washington, D.C., examining a manila envelope under a high-intensity lamp. The envelope, measuring approximately 9 by 12 inches, had been recovered 3 days earlier from a trash receptacle behind a Texaco gas station in Arlington, Virginia. Mitchum, 47 years old, had been working in forensic document analysis for the FBI for 19 years. His specialty was latent fingerprint development, the process of revealing fingerprints that were not immediately visible to the naked eye. The manila envelope bore no return address and no postage marks. According to the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, the envelope had been placed in the trash receptacle as part of what appeared to be a dead drop operation, a method used by intelligence services to pass information without direct contact between parties. Inside the envelope, investigators had found photocopies of 3 classified documents relating to satellite surveillance capabilities being developed by the National Reconnaissance Office. The documents themselves were marked secret and contained technical specifications that, if obtained by Soviet intelligence, could compromise American reconnaissance operations. The envelope had already been processed for obvious fingerprints using basic dusting techniques. 2 clear prints had been found on the exterior surface, both of which had been matched to a known Soviet intelligence officer named Viktor Petrovich Sokolov, who held diplomatic cover as a third secretary at the Soviet embassy. This was not particularly surprising or helpful. Sokolov's presence confirmed that the envelope had been part of a Soviet intelligence operation, but Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover could not be prosecuted under U.S. law. They could be declared persona non grata and expelled, but that would accomplish little beyond temporarily disrupting Soviet intelligence activities in Washington. What the FBI needed was to identify the source of the classified documents, the American who had provided them. That person would have handled the documents before they were placed in the envelope. That person's fingerprints might be on the documents themselves. Mitchum's task that morning was to attempt to develop latent fingerprints from the photocopied documents. This was technically challenging because photocopies, unlike original documents, did not retain fingerprints in the same way. When a person handles paper, oils and moisture from their skin transfer to the surface, creating an impression that can be developed through various chemical processes. But photocopies presented complications. The heat of the photocopying process could degrade fingerprints. The toner used in photocopiers could obscure or interfere with fingerprint development. Many forensic analysts believed that attempting to recover fingerprints from photocopies was not worth the effort. Mitchum had a different view. He had spent the past 5 years experimenting with various chemical reagents and techniques specifically designed for developing latent prints on photocopied documents. His work had been detailed in several internal FBI memoranda and had been presented at a law enforcement conference in 1979. His success rate was not high. Perhaps 1 in 20 attempts yielded usable prints, but when it worked, the results could be decisive. The documents from the manila envelope had been photocopied on standard office equipment. Mitchum could see the characteristic patterns of photocopier drum marks and toner distribution. He began his analysis by examining the documents under ultraviolet light, looking for any fluorescent traces that might indicate fingerprint residue. He saw nothing immediately useful. Next, he prepared a solution of ninhydrin, a chemical reagent that reacts with amino acids in fingerprint residue to produce a purple color. Ninhydrin was particularly effective on paper documents, though it required careful application and several hours to develop. Mitchum used a spray bottle to apply a fine mist of ninhydrin solution to the first document, working in a fume hood to avoid inhaling the chemical vapors. He then placed the document in a humidity chamber set to approximately 80% relative humidity at room temperature. The development process would take between 6 and 24 hours. He repeated this process with the second and third documents, then documented his work in his laboratory notebook, recording the date, time, case number, evidence item numbers, and the specific procedures used. 20 hours later, on the morning of March 7, 1981, Mitchum returned to examine the documents. The ninhydrin had developed several fingerprint impressions on the first document, 4 partial prints, and 2 that appeared to be complete enough for comparison purposes. The second document yielded 3 partial prints. The third document showed 5 prints, including 3 that appeared complete. Mitchum photographed each print using a specialized camera setup designed for forensic documentation. He then began the process of lifting the developed prints using clear adhesive tape, transferring them to white backing cards for preservation and analysis. Each lifted print was labeled with case information and stored in a protective sleeve. The quality of the prints was fair to good. Some showed clear ridge detail, the distinctive patterns of loops, whorls, and arches that make each person's fingerprints unique. Others were smudged or incomplete. But several prints appeared to have sufficient detail for comparison against known fingerprint records. The next step was to determine whose fingerprints these were. In 1981, the FBI's fingerprint database contained approximately 174 million fingerprint cards, representing criminal records, military service records, and government employment records. The database was not computerized. It was a massive physical collection of cards organized according to a classification system developed decades earlier. Searching this database required either knowing specifically whose prints to look for or conducting a manual search through cards that matched the general classification of the prints being examined. The FBI's Counterintelligence Division provided Mitchum with a list of individuals who potentially had access to the classified documents that had been leaked. The list had been compiled by the National Reconnaissance Office's Security Office based on access logs, security clearance records, and compartmented information protocols. The list contained 47 names: engineers, technicians, administrative personnel, and program managers who had legitimate access to information about the satellite surveillance program. Mitchum requested fingerprint cards for all 47 individuals. For government employees with security clearances, fingerprint cards would have been collected as part of the background investigation process. It took 3 days for all 47 cards to be located and delivered to Mitchum's laboratory. On March 10, 1981, Mitchum began the comparison process. Using a comparison microscope that allowed him to view a known print and an unknown print simultaneously, he examined each of the lifted prints against the fingerprint cards from the 47 individuals on the list. The process was methodical and time-consuming. Each comparison required careful examination of ridge patterns, minutiae points, specific characteristics where ridges end or split, and the overall fingerprint classification. For the first 12 cards, Mitchum found no matches. The 13th card belonged to a man named Lawrence Peter Hartman. Hartman, according to the personnel file attached to his fingerprint card, was 39 years old, a senior engineer with the National Reconnaissance Office, and had been employed there since 1973. He held a top-secret security clearance with access to special compartmented information, the highest level of classification for intelligence-related materials. Mitchum placed Hartman's right index fingerprint under the comparison microscope alongside one of the prints lifted from the first classified document. He began identifying minutia points, locations where ridges ended, bifurcated, or formed specific patterns. In fingerprint analysis, finding 12 matching minutia points between two prints is generally considered sufficient for a positive identification, though standards vary by jurisdiction and circumstance. Mitchum identified 18 matching minutia points. The ridge flow, the overall pattern, the spacing between ridges, everything matched. He examined the print carefully, looking for any discrepancies that might indicate an error. He found none. He moved to the next print lifted from the documents and compared it to Hartman's right middle finger. Again, he found a match, 16 minutia points. He continued through the other prints. Of the 10 prints that had been developed from the 3 documents, 7 matched fingerprints belonging to Lawrence Hartman. The other 3 prints were either too fragmentary for definitive comparison or matched no one on the list of 47 individuals. Mitchum documented his findings with detailed notes and photographs showing the matching minutia points. He prepared a formal forensic report concluding that Lawrence Peter Hartman had handled the classified documents that had been found in the dead drop envelope. The level of certainty, based on the quality and quantity of matching minutia points, was described in the report as positive identification. The report was delivered to the FBI's Washington Field Office Counterintelligence Division on March 11, 1981. Special Agent Jennifer Kozlowski, 34 years old, had been the case agent responsible for the investigation into the classified leak. She had been with the FBI for 8 years and had worked counterintelligence cases for the past 4. When she received Mitchum's report, she immediately recognized its significance. The fingerprint evidence provided probable cause for a more intensive investigation of Lawrence Hartman. Lawrence Peter Hartman had been born in 1942 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. His father, Arthur Hartman, had worked as an accountant for a manufacturing company. His mother, Dorothy, had been a homemaker. According to background investigation records compiled when Hartman had first received his security clearance, he had been an excellent student with particular strengths in mathematics and physics. He had attended the Massachusetts Institute of Technology on a scholarship, studying aerospace engineering, and had graduated in 1964 with honors. After graduation, Hartman had worked briefly for Boeing before being hired by the National Reconnaissance Office in 1966. The NRO, established in 1961, and whose existence was classified until 1992, was responsible for developing and operating reconnaissance satellites for the U.S. intelligence community. Hartman's work focused on satellite sensor systems, the cameras and other devices that collected intelligence from orbit. In 1967, Hartman had married Carol Bennett, a woman he had met through friends in Washington, D.C. Carol, 25 years old at the time of the marriage, worked as a librarian at Georgetown University. Their first child, a daughter named Rebecca, was born in 1970. Their second child, a son named Michael, was born in 1973. The Hartman family lived in a 2-story colonial house in McLean, Virginia, in a neighborhood of similar houses occupied primarily by government employees and their families. The house, purchased in 1972, had 4 bedrooms, a small yard, and a detached garage. According to later interviews with neighbors, the family appeared normal and unremarkable. Lawrence drove to work each morning in a Chevrolet sedan. Carol worked part-time at the library and was active in the children's school activities. Rebecca and Michael attended local public schools and played with neighborhood children. Agent Kozlowski initiated surveillance of Lawrence Hartman on March 12, 1981. One day after receiving the fingerprint analysis report, the surveillance was designated as close tail, maintaining constant visual contact with the subject while attempting to avoid detection. A team of 6 agents working in rotating shifts began documenting Hartman's movements. For the first week, Hartman's routine appeared entirely ordinary. He left his house each morning between 7 and 7:15 a.m., drove approximately 12 miles to the National Reconnaissance Office's facility in Chantilly, Virginia, and arrived at work between 7:30 and 7:45 a.m. He remained at the facility throughout the day, with occasional breaks for lunch at the facility's cafeteria or at nearby restaurants. He departed work between 5:30 and 6 p.m., and drove directly home, arriving between 6 and 6:30 p.m. On weekends, Hartman engaged in typical suburban activities. He mowed the lawn, washed his car, took his children to soccer practices and birthday parties. He and Carol attended a dinner party at a neighbor's house on Saturday, March 14th. They went to church, a Methodist congregation, on Sunday morning, March 15th. Nothing in Hartman's observed behavior suggested espionage activity. The FBI obtained authorization for a wiretap on the Hartman residence telephone line. For 2 weeks, the wiretap produced only routine domestic conversations, discussions about grocery shopping, children's homework, scheduling doctor's appointments, and similar matters. There were no suspicious calls, no coded language, no indication of any clandestine activity. On March 28, 1981, 17 days after the fingerprint match had been confirmed, Hartman's routine changed. According to surveillance logs, he left the National Reconnaissance Office facility at approximately 3:15 p.m., earlier than his usual departure time. Instead of driving directly home, he drove south on Interstate 95 toward Fredericksburg, Virginia. FBI agents following Hartman documented his vehicle exiting the interstate and driving into a residential area on the outskirts of Fredericksburg. He drove for approximately 20 minutes through various neighborhoods, making several turns that appeared designed to detect surveillance. Eventually, he parked his vehicle at a small shopping center, anchored by a grocery store and a pharmacy. Hartman exited his vehicle and entered the grocery store. FBI agents, maintaining surveillance from various positions in the parking lot, watched through the store's windows as Hartman selected several items: bread, milk, and other groceries. He proceeded to the checkout line, paid for his purchases, and returned to his vehicle. He then drove to a nearby park, Mott's Run Reservoir Park, a small recreational area with walking trails and picnic facilities. He parked in the main parking lot, removed his grocery bags from the car, and began walking along one of the trails that circled the reservoir. 3 FBI agents followed on foot, maintaining distances of 50 to 100 yards. Hartman walked along the trail for approximately 15 minutes. At a point where the trail passed close to the water's edge, near a concrete drainage culvert that channeled water into the reservoir, Hartman stopped. He appeared to check that no one else was nearby. The park was not busy on this weekday afternoon, and then he bent down near the culvert. According to the surveillance report filed by Agent Desmond Archer, who had the closest visual position, Hartman reached into one of his grocery bags and withdrew what appeared to be a plastic container of the type used for food storage. He placed this container inside a crevice in the concrete culvert structure, where it would not be visible to anyone walking past on the trail. He then covered the container with several small rocks and some dead leaves. Hartman stood, picked up his grocery bags, and continued walking along the trail. He completed a loop that brought him back to the parking lot, got into his vehicle, and drove back toward McLean, arriving home at approximately 5:45 p.m. FBI agents remained at the park, maintaining surveillance on the culvert where Hartman had placed the container. At approximately 7:30 p.m., as daylight was fading, a man entered the park and began walking along the same trail Hartman had used. Surveillance photographs later identified this man as Dmitry Alexandrovich Kuzmin, 43 years old, a second secretary at the Soviet embassy who was assessed by the FBI to be a KGB intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover. Kuzmin walked directly to the area where Hartman had placed the container. He stopped at the culvert, looked around briefly, reached into the crevice, retrieved the container, and placed it inside a canvas bag he was carrying. He then continued walking along the trail and returned to his vehicle, which was parked in the same parking lot Hartman had used. He drove back toward Washington, D.C. The FBI now had documentation of the entire operation, Hartman placing a container at a dead drop site and a known Soviet intelligence officer retrieving it. On April 1, 1981, 4 days after observing the dead drop operation, the FBI contacted the National Reconnaissance Office's security office and requested a detailed audit of what classified materials Hartman had accessed in the weeks leading up to March 28th. The audit, completed over the next 5 days, revealed that Hartman had accessed computer files containing technical specifications for a new satellite sensor system being developed under a program classified as Special Access Required, even more restricted than Top Secret. The program, codenamed Keystone, involved advanced optical sensors capable of higher resolution imagery than previous systems. According to the NRO Security Office, Hartman had accessed Keystone-related files on March 23rd, March 25th, and March 27th, the week immediately preceding the dead drop operation. The FBI now had evidence suggesting a pattern. Hartman accessing highly classified information followed shortly by a dead drop operation involving a Soviet intelligence officer. Combined with the fingerprint evidence linking Hartman to the previous document leak in March, the case appeared substantial. Agent Kozlowski knew that espionage cases often required extensive evidence to ensure successful prosecution. The FBI continued its surveillance and initiated efforts to determine how long Hartman had been engaged in espionage and what other information he might have compromised. A review of Hartman's work computer access logs, going back 2 years to 1979, revealed a pattern. Approximately every 6 to 8 weeks, Hartman would access classified files outside his normal work requirements, information he did not need for his assigned projects. These access events were not necessarily suspicious in isolation. Engineers often reviewed files for various legitimate reasons, but when mapped against other indicators, a pattern emerged. The FBI cross-referenced dates when Hartman had accessed sensitive files against surveillance footage from cameras positioned near known Soviet embassy safehouses and meeting locations in the Washington area. The footage, collected over the previous 2 years as part of routine counterintelligence operations, showed Hartman on 3 separate occasions in locations where Soviet intelligence officers had been observed conducting surveillance detection runs, preparatory activities conducted before espionage meetings to ensure they were not being followed by law enforcement. On June 18, 1979, surveillance footage showed Hartman at a public library in Alexandria, Virginia, at approximately 2:30 p.m. on a weekday, during what should have been his work hours. He appeared to be browsing books, but was observed by FBI analysts, reviewing the footage to be looking frequently toward the entrance. Approximately 15 minutes after Hartman had arrived, Viktor Sokolov entered the library. The two men did not appear to interact directly, but both were in the library for approximately 30 minutes, and both departed within 5 minutes of each other. On October 3, 1979, footage captured Hartman at a bus stop on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C. at approximately 5:45 p.m. He appeared to be waiting for a bus, though records indicated he had driven his personal vehicle to work that day. About 10 minutes later, Dmitry Kuzmin walked past the bench where Hartman sat. According to FBI analysis, Kuzmin appeared to drop a newspaper as he passed. Hartman picked it up moments later, placed it in his briefcase, then left the bus stop and walked several blocks to where his vehicle was parked. These observations, combined with the fingerprint evidence and the documented dead drop operation, suggested that Hartman had been engaged in espionage for at least 2 years, and possibly longer. The FBI made the decision to arrest Lawrence Hartman and search his residence. The arrest was executed on April 15, 1981, at approximately 6 a.m. at the Hartman residence in McLean. According to the arresting agent's reports, 6 agents arrived at the house as dawn was breaking. They knocked on the front door, and Carol Hartman answered wearing a bathrobe. She appeared confused and frightened when the agents identified themselves and presented an arrest warrant for her husband. Lawrence Hartman was in the kitchen preparing coffee. According to Agent Kozlowski, who led the arrest team, Hartman's reaction when informed he was being arrested for espionage was one of resignation rather than surprise. His first words were, "I suppose this was inevitable." Rebecca Hartman, then 11 years old, and Michael Hartman, then 8 years old, were awakened by the commotion. Both children came downstairs to find FBI agents in their house and their father being placed in handcuffs. According to later testimony from Carol Hartman, Rebecca began crying and asking what was happening. Michael, younger and less understanding of the situation, asked if his father had done something wrong. Carol had no knowledge of her husband's espionage activities and was unable to provide any explanation that made sense to the children or to herself. Lawrence Hartman was transported to the FBI's Washington field office. A simultaneous search of the Hartman residence, conducted under warrant, produced significant evidence. Agents found in Hartman's home office, in a locked file cabinet, several documents that appeared to be instructions for dead drop procedures and meeting protocols. The documents were written in what appeared to be a simple substitution cipher, but the FBI's cryptanalysis unit was able to decode them within hours. The decoded instructions included specific locations for dead drops, several of which matched sites where FBI surveillance had previously observed unexplained activities by known Soviet intelligence officers. The instructions also included emergency contact procedures and protocols for signaling meetings. Agents also found approximately $18,000 in cash hidden in the garage, inside a toolbox that appeared to be rarely used. The cash was in various denominations and showed no obvious signs of recent bank withdrawal, suggesting it had been accumulated over time as payment for espionage activities. Perhaps most significantly, agents found photographic equipment, a 35mm camera equipped with a macro lens designed for document photography, rolls of high-speed film suitable for low-light photography, and a portable copying light setup. This equipment confirmed that Hartman had been photographing classified documents, presumably for transfer to Soviet intelligence. Lawrence Hartman was formally charged in federal district court with conspiracy to commit espionage, unauthorized disclosure of national defense information, and unauthorized retention of classified documents. The charges carried potential sentences totaling life imprisonment. The case was assigned to Judge Catherine Morrison of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia. Hartman was initially held without bail, deemed a flight risk given the seriousness of the charges and his demonstrated connections to Soviet intelligence. He was represented by a public defender as his family's financial resources were limited. During the initial interrogation sessions conducted over the first week following his arrest, Hartman exercised his right to remain silent on the advice of his attorney. On April 30, 1981, 15 days after his arrest, Hartman's attorney approached federal prosecutors with an offer to negotiate a plea agreement. According to later court records, the attorney indicated that Hartman was willing to plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a reduced sentence and immunity for any potential co-conspirators, a provision that was relevant primarily to protect his wife, Carol, though investigations had found no evidence of her knowledge or involvement. The federal prosecutors agreed to negotiate. Over the next 6 weeks, Hartman participated in extensive debriefing sessions with FBI counterintelligence agents. The debriefings, conducted between May and June of 1981, revealed the scope and duration of Hartman's espionage activities. According to Hartman's testimony, he had first been approached by Soviet intelligence in the summer of 1975, approximately 6 years before his arrest. The approach had occurred at a technical conference in San Francisco, where Hartman had been presenting a paper on satellite sensor calibration. A man who introduced himself as Dr. Peter Ashton, claiming to be a professor of engineering from a university in Canada, had engaged Hartman in conversation about his work. The relationship had developed over several months, with this supposed professor maintaining contact through occasional letters and phone calls. The letters and calls were always initiated by him, and Hartman was never provided with reliable contact information. The conversations focused initially on technical topics and then gradually shifted to discussions of U.S. defense policy, military spending, and the Cold War. According to Hartman's debriefing testimony, Dr. Ashton had eventually revealed himself to be not a Canadian professor, but a representative of Soviet intelligence. This revelation, Hartman claimed, had occurred during a meeting in Washington, D.C. in early 1976. Rather than being shocked or refusing further contact, Hartman had continued the relationship. When FBI interrogators asked why, Hartman provided explanations that seemed to shift depending on the question. At times, he emphasized his philosophical opposition to certain U.S. defense policies and his belief that sharing information with the Soviets might contribute to strategic stability. At other times, he acknowledged that he had been flattered by the attention and had enjoyed feeling valued by his Soviet contacts. At still other times, he admitted that the financial compensation, approximately $2,500 to $4,000, was not enough. 000 per transfer of information had been welcome given his family's financial pressures, including mortgage payments, car loans, and the costs of raising 2 children. Over approximately 5 years, from 1976 to 1981, Hartman had provided Soviet intelligence with information on at least 12 separate satellite systems and sensor technologies. The financial compensation Hartman had received totaled approximately $43,000 over the 5-year period, substantially more than the $18,000 found in his garage, suggesting that much of the money had been spent on ordinary family expenses rather than saved or invested. The method of transferring information had evolved over time. According to Hartman's debriefings, he had initially provided information through face-to-face meetings with his Soviet contact, typically in public locations like parks, libraries, or restaurants. These meetings had been brief, no more than 5 or 10 minutes, and had involved the exchange of packages or envelopes in ways designed to appear innocent to any observers. As the relationship had continued, the tradecraft had become more sophisticated. Hartman had been trained in dead-drop procedures, which allowed information transfer without direct contact and reduced the risk of surveillance detection. He had been provided with the photographic equipment found in his home office and had been instructed on how to photograph classified documents without removing them from his workplace. He had been given instructions on how to signal the need for meetings, how to detect surveillance, and how to use public transportation and other methods to shake potential surveillance before operational meetings. The fingerprint evidence that had initiated the investigation into Hartman had come from a dead-drop operation conducted on March 3, 1981, involving the manila envelope found at the Texaco gas station in Arlington. According to Hartman's testimony, he had photographed the 3 classified documents, placed the photographic film in the envelope, and deposited the envelope in the trash receptacle where it had been retrieved by Viktor Sokolov. What Hartman had not known was that FBI surveillance of Sokolov, conducted as part of routine counterintelligence monitoring of Soviet embassy personnel, had observed the retrieval and had recovered the envelope after Sokolov had transferred it to another location. Gerald Mitchum's forensic analysis revealed Hartman's fingerprints on the documents because Hartman had handled them while reviewing them before photographing them. The photocopies had retained latent fingerprint residue from the original documents, a forensic connection Hartman had not anticipated. On August 14, 1981, Lawrence Hartman appeared in federal district court and entered guilty pleas to 3 counts of espionage-related charges. In exchange for his guilty pleas and his cooperation with investigators, prosecutors recommended a sentence of 35 years in federal prison rather than the potential life sentence he had faced if convicted at trial. Judge Morrison, in her sentencing remarks on September 3, 1981, emphasized the severity of Hartman's betrayal. She noted that he had held a position of extraordinary trust, had access to some of the nation's most sensitive intelligence programs, and had systematically violated that trust over a period of 5 years. She acknowledged his cooperation with investigators, but stated that such cooperation, while valuable, could not fully mitigate the damage he had caused to national security. Hartman was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison, 5 years more than the sentence prosecutors had recommended. Under federal sentencing guidelines in effect at the time, he would be eligible for parole after serving approximately 13 years, assuming good behavior. The impact on Carol Hartman and the children was immediate and catastrophic. Carol found herself suddenly alone, responsible for 2 children, and facing severe financial hardship. Lawrence's income had been the family's primary financial support. Carol's part-time work at the university library provided modest income, but it was insufficient to cover the mortgage, utilities, and other expenses. Within 2 months of Lawrence's arrest, Carol made the decision to sell the house in McLean. The proceeds from the sale, after paying off the mortgage and other debts, left her with approximately $23,000, barely enough to rent an apartment and support the family for several months, while she sought full-time employment. She found a small 2-bedroom apartment in Arlington, Virginia, in a building that was less expensive but also less safe and less well-maintained than their previous neighborhood. Rebecca and Michael, who had lived their entire lives in the McLean house and had attended the same schools and played with the same neighborhood children, were uprooted and enrolled in new schools where they knew no one. The social consequences were severe. Once the news media reported Lawrence Hartman's arrest and guilty plea, the Hartman family became known in their community, At Rebecca's new middle school, other students who had seen news coverage or heard their parents discussing the case began to avoid her or, in some cases, to harass her. According to later interviews Rebecca gave to researchers studying the impact of parental incarceration on children, she was called a traitor's daughter and was excluded from social groups and activities. Her academic performance, which had been above average before her father's arrest, declined significantly. She became withdrawn and depressed. Michael, at 8 years old, understood less about what his father had done. Carol's attempts to explain were complicated by her own limited understanding of espionage and by her desire to protect her young son from harsh realities. She told Michael that his father had made serious mistakes at work and was in prison as a result. Michael struggled to understand why mistakes at work would result in such severe punishment and why his family's entire life had been destroyed. Carol attempted to maintain some connection between the children and their father by facilitating occasional visits to the federal prison where Lawrence was incarcerated. Initially, the Federal Correctional Institution in Petersburg, Virginia. These visits were difficult for everyone involved. The prison visiting room was loud, crowded, and intimidating for young children. Lawrence appeared in prison clothing, often visibly depressed. The visits were limited to 1 hour and were supervised by guards. Conversation was stilted and uncomfortable. According to Carol's later testimony in a documentary interview conducted in 2003, Rebecca stopped wanting to visit her father after approximately a year. She told her mother that the visits made her sad and that she didn't know what to say to him. Michael continued to visit occasionally, but appeared to get little comfort from these interactions. By 1984, 3 years after Lawrence's incarceration, the visits had stopped altogether. In 1985, Carol filed for divorce. Court records indicate that the divorce was uncontested and was finalized in early 1986. Carol cited irreconcilable differences, though the actual reason was her husband's espionage conviction and imprisonment, along with her need to provide a stable life for her children without the ongoing connection to a convicted spy. The long-term consequences for Rebecca and Michael Hartman were profound and lasting. Rebecca, who struggled throughout her teenage years with depression and social isolation, barely graduated from high school in 1988. She did not attend college and instead worked a series of retail and service jobs. According to later accounts, she changed her last name legally in 1991 at age 21 in an attempt to distance herself from her father's crimes and to reduce the likelihood that employers or acquaintances would make the connection. Michael's experience was somewhat different but equally difficult. He grew up with a fragmentary understanding of what his father had done, shaped more by his mother's protective explanations and his own imagination than by actual facts. It wasn't until he was in high school in the late 1980s and doing a research project on the Cold War that he fully confronted the reality of his father's espionage. A history teacher, not knowing Michael's family connection, had assigned research on Soviet espionage cases in America. Michael, researching at the library, came across newspaper archives from 1981 that detailed his father's arrest, guilty plea, and sentencing. According to Michael's own later account, given in an interview in 2008, discovering the full truth about his father's crimes, reading the newspaper descriptions of the classified information that had been compromised, the damage assessment, the judge's sentencing remarks, was devastating. He felt betrayed not only by his father, but also by his mother for not having been honest with him. His relationship with Carol became strained during his late teenage years. He left home shortly after graduating from high school in 1991 and had minimal contact with his family for several years thereafter. Lawrence Hartman served 27 years of his 40-year sentence. According to Bureau of Prisons records, his conduct in prison was generally compliant. He participated in educational programs and worked in the prison library. He had minimal contact with his family, occasional letters from Carol before the divorce, and very rare letters from his children in the first few years after his incarceration. He was released on parole in December 2008 at the age of 66. By that time, the Cold War had been over for nearly 2 decades, and the Soviet Union had dissolved. He moved to a halfway house in Richmond, Virginia, and was required to report regularly to a parole officer. He found employment doing technical documentation work for a small engineering company, work that required no security clearance and paid modestly. His relationship with his children remained distant. Rebecca, who had married and had children of her own, declined to have any contact with him. According to acquaintances, she told people that as far as she was concerned, her father had died in 1981. Michael had sporadic contact, a few phone calls, one brief meeting in 2009, but their relationship was characterized by unresolved anger and an inability to bridge decades of absence and betrayal. Carol, who had remarried in 1995 to a man who worked in retail management, also declined contact with Lawrence after his release. She had built a new life with a new name and a new family and had no desire to revisit the trauma of the 1980s. Lawrence Hartman lived alone in a small apartment in Richmond for the remainder of his life. According to people who knew him during this period, he was quiet, socially isolated, and appeared to carry significant regret about his past. He gave only one interview to a researcher studying espionage cases in 2011. In that interview, he spoke about the fingerprint evidence that had led to his identification. He acknowledged that he had not understood the science of forensic fingerprint analysis when he had been active. He had assumed that photocopying documents would eliminate any fingerprint evidence, not realizing that prints could be recovered from photocopies through advanced latent print development techniques. He had not known that handling documents before photographing them would leave residue that could survive the photographic process and be retrieved by skilled forensic analysts. He called Gerald Mitchum's forensic work brilliant and unfortunate. Brilliant, because it represented a significant advance in forensic science. Unfortunate, because it had led to Hartman's capture. He acknowledged that if not for the fingerprint evidence, he might have continued espionage activities for years longer or might never have been caught at all. When asked about his motivations for espionage, Hartman gave answers similar to those he had provided 30 years earlier during his FBI debriefings. He spoke of political convictions that he now viewed as naive, intellectual engagement that he recognized as vanity, and financial motivations that he acknowledged as greed. But he also spoke with evident pain about the impact on his family, particularly his children. He described receiving a letter from Rebecca in the early 1990s, shortly after she had changed her name, in which she wrote that she could never forgive him for destroying her childhood and for making her ashamed of her family. He described the absence of any meaningful relationship with Michael despite his attempts to reach out after his release. He acknowledged that while he had served his legal sentence and had been released on parole, the real punishment was permanent: the loss of his family, the knowledge of the harm he had caused to people who had loved and trusted him. When asked whether he believed his espionage had accomplished anything of value, he was quiet for a long time before answering. He said that he had believed at the time he was contributing to strategic stability by sharing information that would help Soviet planners understand American capabilities. But in retrospect, he could not identify any specific outcome that justified the harm. Lawrence Hartman died on November 7, 2016, at the age of 74 from complications related to heart disease. His obituary in the Richmond newspaper made no mention of his espionage conviction, listing only his birth date, death date, and his survivors, 2 children from his first marriage. Neither Rebecca nor Michael attended his funeral. According to the funeral director's records, the service was attended by 3 people: a parole officer who had maintained contact with Hartman after his release, a neighbor from his apartment building, and a retired co-worker from the engineering company where he had worked. Gerald Mitchum, the forensic analyst whose fingerprint work had been crucial to identifying Hartman, continued his career with the FBI until his retirement in 1997. In interviews he gave after retiring, he reflected on the Hartman case as an example of how advances in forensic science could have decisive impact on counterintelligence investigations. His techniques for developing latent fingerprints from photocopied documents were refined and documented in FBI training materials and were used in subsequent espionage investigations. Mitchum noted that the science of fingerprint analysis had continued to advance throughout the 1980s and 1990s with new chemical reagents, improved optical techniques, and eventually computer-assisted comparison systems that made fingerprint matching faster and more reliable. But he also noted that the fundamental principle remained unchanged. People leave traces of themselves on everything they touch, and those traces can be recovered and analyzed if investigators know where to look and how to process the evidence. Agent Jennifer Kozlowski, who had led the FBI's investigation into Hartman, also continued her career in counterintelligence until retiring in 2002. In later interviews, she emphasized that the Hartman case demonstrated the value of systematic surveillance, careful evidence collection, and forensic analysis. The fingerprint evidence had provided the initial identification, but it was the comprehensive investigation, the surveillance of dead drops, the audit of classified file access, the search of Hartman's residence, and the debriefings after his arrest that had revealed the full scope of his espionage activities. The classified documents that Hartman had provided to Soviet intelligence between 1976 and 1981 were assessed by the National Reconnaissance Office and other intelligence agencies through a comprehensive damage assessment completed in the summer of 1981. The assessment concluded that Hartman's espionage had compromised several reconnaissance satellite programs, providing the Soviet Union with detailed knowledge of U.S. satellite capabilities and limitations. This information would have affected Soviet military planning, potentially allowing them to develop countermeasures or adjust their own satellite programs. However, satellite technology advanced rapidly throughout the 1980s, making much of the information Hartman had provided obsolete within a decade. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 fundamentally changed the strategic landscape, rendering many Cold War-era intelligence advantages irrelevant. Whether Hartman's espionage affected specific Soviet military decisions or programs remains unknown and likely unknowable, as much of the relevant Soviet documentation remains classified or has been destroyed. What is certain is the human cost. Carol Hartman spent decades recovering from the trauma of her husband's arrest, building a new life, and helping her children cope with the aftermath. Rebecca Hartman struggled for years with depression, social isolation, and a sense of shame that influenced her relationships, career choices, and her own sense of identity. Michael Hartman grew up without a father, discovered the truth about his father's crimes in a traumatic way, and spent years dealing with anger and confusion about his family history. The question of responsibility in espionage cases is complicated because it requires assigning accountability among individuals who were operating within systems that shaped their choices and constrained their options. Lawrence Hartman chose to commit espionage. He chose to accept an approach from Soviet intelligence, chose to provide classified information, chose to accept payment, and chose to continue the relationship for 5 years. Those choices were his, and he bore responsibility for them and their consequences, but he made those choices in a Cold War context that encouraged ideological polarization and created opportunities for espionage. The classification system that made information valuable to Soviet intelligence also created administrative complexity and imperfect oversight. The security clearance process that granted Hartman access to sensitive information was based on background checks and periodic reviews that could not detect every potential vulnerability. The Soviet intelligence services that recruited and handled him were operating according to the logic of their system, which valued intelligence collection and treated human assets as tools. All of these individuals and systems contributed to outcomes that harmed people who had no agency in the situation. Carol Hartman, Rebecca Hartman, Michael Hartman, and many others whose lives were affected by the case. The fingerprint evidence that Gerald Mitchum developed on March 7, 1981, revealed Lawrence Hartman's identity and initiated an investigation that would send him to prison for 27 years. But forensic evidence, however scientifically rigorous, can only reveal certain kinds of truth. It can connect a person to a document or a location. It can establish that someone handled specific materials at specific times. It can provide the foundation for legal prosecution. What forensic evidence cannot reveal is motivation, justification, or the complex web of decisions and circumstances that lead someone to betray their country. It cannot show the psychological processes by which someone rationalizes espionage as contribution to peace rather than betrayal. It cannot capture the moment-by-moment choices someone makes to continue a clandestine relationship, to ignore doubts, to compartmentalize the implications of their actions. And it cannot measure the rippling consequences that extend outward from one person's choices, affecting families, careers, and lives in ways that persist for decades. The Hartman case demonstrates both the power and the limitations of forensic science in counterintelligence investigations. Mitchum's fingerprint analysis provided definitive identification that would have been impossible to achieve through traditional investigative methods alone. Without that forensic evidence, Hartman might have remained undetected for years or might never have been caught. The fingerprints on photocopied documents were physical proof that could not be explained away or rationalized. But the forensic evidence was only one element in a complex investigation. It required surveillance to observe operational behavior, document analysis to understand what information had been compromised, and interrogation to reveal the full scope of Hartman's activities. The case required cooperation between multiple agencies, systematic analysis of patterns, and investigators who understood both the technical aspects of espionage tradecraft and the human dimensions of recruitment and motivation. The broader implications of the Hartman case relate to the relationship between individuals and systems in intelligence operations. Hartman was neither a monster nor a hero. He was an ordinary person, a competent engineer, a husband, a father, who made choices that he rationalized at the time, who enjoyed feeling valued by his Soviet contacts, who used the money to pay ordinary family expenses, and who failed to anticipate or understand the full consequences of his actions. When those consequences became unavoidable, when he was arrested, when his family was destroyed, when his children were traumatized, he experienced what appeared to be genuine remorse. But that remorse, however sincere, could not undo the harm. It could not restore his relationship with his children, repair the damage to national security, or mitigate the years his family spent dealing with the aftermath of his choices. The fingerprints that connected Lawrence Hartman to classified leaks were physical evidence of his contact with documents. But they were also metaphorical, traces he left on his family, on his colleagues, on the systems he betrayed. Those traces persisted long after his arrest, long after his imprisonment, long after his release. They shaped Rebecca's identity, Michael's understanding of family, Carol's ability to trust, and many other lives in ways both visible and invisible. Lawrence Hartman was 39 years old when Gerald Mitchum first examined his fingerprints under a comparison microscope in March 1981. He was 74 when he died, largely alone, estranged from his children, carrying the knowledge that his choices had destroyed not only his own life, but the lives of people he loved. The fingerprints that connected him to espionage were recovered through sophisticated forensic techniques that represented advances in scientific investigation. But no forensic technique could measure or quantify the human cost of what he did, the harm that extended across decades and generations, or the questions without easy answers about responsibility, choice, and consequence in a world divided by ideology and secrecy.